Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in the last video we were talking about functions, okay? And we're going to go deeper in the functions, but I realized we forgot to talk about loops. So we're going to go back and talk about loops and maybe objects before we get too much deeper into functions. But at least now you know how to define a function, you know some basic array methods from the previous video. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to create a new, we'll call this, let's see if we can do both, loops.js. Maybe we'll do objects as well, but we'll cross that bridge. So in the same way, like if statements said, hey, you know, do this if this is true, or do that if it's false, a loop basically says, hey, repeat this code as long as this thing is true. That's what a loop does. And there's different ways to loop in JavaScript, because you may want to repeat the same code and you don't want to have to write out the thing, and maybe you don't even know how many times you have to loop. So having some sort of looping construct, some sort of repetitive construct, is beneficial for us to be able to do things that we need to do over and over again. So the first loop we'll talk about, and what we'll do is we'll create a variable. So we'll say let counter, because it's going to be the variable we use to count. So that's going to be a number. Okay, and we'll let count start off at 0. Okay. Oh, and because I didn't name this a Typescript file. There we go. So again, loops.ts, we were using Typescript mainly. Okay, so I have a counter, and I want to say while counter is less than, so basically what happens, while takes a Boolean expression, just kind of like we talked about when we talked about expressions. So while counter is less than 10, so long as that statement is true, the code in these curly brackets will run. Okay. So I want to console.log counter. Now, the problem is if I were to run this code right now, it would run forever, right? Because counter would still just be 0. So it would loop, and then counter would be 0 again, and then counter would be 0 again, then counter would be 0 again. So it'll always be less than 10. So typically when you have that counter, what we're going to want to do is make sure that that it changes. It eventually gets to, you know, not less than 10, so that way this loop doesn't run forever. So that's always the thing you have to be careful when you're trying to do repetitive loops, that at some point the loop ends. Because if not, you're going to lock up your computer for eternity, and then you'll have to restart your computer. So at the end of each round, what we're going to do is we're going to do counter. I could either do counter plus plus, which means it's called increment. This will do is add 1 to counter. But an even better way to do this is you do plus equals 1. So essentially this counter plus equals 1 is the same thing as me doing counter equals counter plus 1, which means counter is 0, plus 1 is 1. The result of that expression is what counter equals. But I can trim that down and make that plus equals 1. Okay, so again, this is the same thing as me writing counter equals counter plus 1. But except I don't have to write counter twice. So, and I can do that with minus, I can do that with multiply. That's the benefit of using that over increment. Because increment just means plus 1. But what if I want to add 2? I could do plus equals 2, I could do plus equals 3. It's a lot more flexible and also a lot more predictable, because there are some nuances with increment depending on whether you put the plus plus before or after the variable name. So typically, honestly, you should just stick to this. This is going to make your life, sticking to that's going to prevent the random questions you may have in life in random situations. Okay, so that's going to add 1. So essentially every time this runs, so the first time counter is 0, 0 is less than 10. We'll log the counter, then we'll add 1 to it. So now counter is 1, which is still less than 10. And it just keeps looping that way. So let's try running it. So if I do Deno run loops.ts, and see, it just runs loops 10 times, 0 through 9. Because again, once it hits 10, 10 is not less than 10, so that's no longer true, so it doesn't run that last time. Okay, that's all a loop is. It's going to just keep repeating doing that exact code until it's no longer true. Now, what if I wanted to like create a situation where like it breaks out of the code early, it breaks out of the loop early? What I can do is I can use the word break. So if I do the word break here, once it hits that word break, it just stops the loop. So notice this code gets dimmed because it'll never get there. So if I run the code now, it'll just console log 0 the first time and then stop because the loop stopped. But this can be useful if you want to make sure it breaks in a particular scenario. So let's say maybe I want the code to break if counter modulo 5 equals 0, meaning the number is divisible by 5. And then we'll say if that's the case, then break. Okay. So now if I do this, it'll still say 0. I'll pick a 0 modulo 5 equals 0. Okay. And so we can make this a compound thing, so we can say and counter is greater than 0. So both of those have to be true for that break to run. And see, it counts up to 5 because at that point the counter is greater than 0 and also divisible by 5. So break is just a word to say, hey, end the loop early, which you can use if you need to. Now, another way we can do this loop is called a for loop. We can take that same logic, okay? So if we were to take the same, actually we'll take the same logic, what we can do is this. We can do for, but instead of having to declare this variable by itself, the counter, we can just say let counter equal 0. So let counter, which should be a number, equals 0. We can still just take every opportunity to type. And then you put the expression here, as long as counter is less than 10. So same thing. And then at the end of each loop, we'll just say counter plus equals 1. See, that's the same exact thing as before, except instead of having to spread it out here, here, and here, we can put it all in one line. So that's the difference between a for loop. It's the same thing, except you can express all that stuff here. Okay, you don't have to necessarily do it piece by piece because they know this is a very common way of writing a loop. So in that case, they created a construct that allows you to kind of follow that familiar pattern. Okay, so now all I can do is I can just say, hey, if, console.log counter, and then say if, just to kind of make it exactly the same as the previous one, if the number is divisible by 5, and the counter is greater than 0, then let's say counter, will break. And that's it. So this is the same thing as the previous loop, but you see it's like taking up a lot less space. So oftentimes this for loop is going to be sort of your main sort of go-to looping construct if you're not looping over arrays, which we'll go over in a moment. But if I run this, I'm going to get the same result. Should loop to 5, because again, at 5 is divisible by 5 and greater than 0, so we hit that break statement. But otherwise, it's running just like before. At the end of each loop, it's going to add 1 to counter. We declare a counter at the beginning of the loop, and it's going to keep running the loop until counter is no longer less than 10. Okay, so yeah, that's all it is. It's just saying, hey, keep repeating this code until this thing is true. Keep repeating this code until this thing is true. So those are the two main ways of looping. So you can use a while loop, you can use a for loop. Now, when you're talking about arrays have a some special extra features. So I'll comment that out. Let's create an array. So we'll say const myArray equals, and let's make sure to type it. So it's going to be an array of numbers. Because again, we're using Typscript, so we should type as often as we can to get the full benefit of Typescript. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's the thing. What if I want to loop this array? I could use a normal for loop. So how would I do that? I could say for, and we'll say index, because now we're going to be using that counter to represent the index of the array. So it starts with 0, because again, the first index is 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So we would say like let index, which again should be a number, equals 0. So because we're starting with this first index 0. And then we want to keep repeating, so keep looping until index, long as index is less than the array's length. So every array has a length property that's the exact number of items. So it'll be 5. Which makes sense, right? Because the highest index is going to be 4, because it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll keep looping as long as the index is less than 5, which means the highest number it'll loop over is 4. Okay, so and again, any array, you can always access that length through just .length. That's the length property. It's built into every array. Oops, And then we put in our, we add one. So at the end of each loop, we're just going to add one to index, and there we go. So that should loop as many times as there are items in the array, and now I can access the item. So I'll create a variable here called item at the beginning of each loop, okay, which will equal an item in the array. Now, what is each item in the array? A number, so let's type it as a number. So it should be a number. And again, if you were to write this in JavaScript, it would be the exact same thing, but without types. That's all it is. Typescript is just JavaScript with types. So the only thing different in JavaScript would be to, again, remove all these type annotations. And we're going to just say at the beginning of each loop, we'll create this item variable, which should just be my array at the current index. Because again, the first time it'll be 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. And then let's console.log the item. Okay, and that's going to loop over the array. Let's see, it looped over the array. Now, if I add another item to the array, 6, it should still work. Why? Because now the array's length is 6. So now it'll loop 0 through 5. And make sure we get all the items. That works pretty well. But we can do this in a simpler way. So because this is going to be such a typical thing to do, they created a shortcut to writing this all out. So I could write this all out. That's fine. Okay. But I could also just do this. For item of my array. So what you do is you declare a variable first. So what we're doing is we're declaring a variable, let item. And again, we know that the array is an array of numbers. So item should be a number. Okay. I guess it doesn't like me typing it in the middle of an of. So let item of array. So it's going to sit there and say, hey, for each item in the array. So on each loop, it's automatically going to store first 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6 in this variable called item. So now I can just console.log item. This is essentially the same thing as this. Okay, I'm literally just saying loop over the number of items in an array. So I should see the same thing twice, 1 through 6, 1 through 6. See, 1 through 6, 1 through 6. Okay, that's pretty cool, right? And then another way we can do this is our arrays actually have a built-in function for looping over them called for each that essentially pretty much works like this, or like both of these. What it does is it's going to take a function and then run that function. That's referred to as a callback. Okay, when you give a function to another function. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called, the thing to do on each loop. That's what we'll call it, because that's what it is. And we're going to say that this function, whenever you use this for each function, you need to define a function that takes in two things. The item, which is the item in the array. And again, each item in our array is a number, so we'll type it as a number. And then it's also going to take in, the second argument will be the index, which is always a number because index is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this function doesn't need to return anything because for each does not return anything. So we can just do this. Okay, so this function will describe what we're going to do on each loop. So we'll say just console.log the item. Okay, so I have this function now. Okay, and now I can say, hey, my array dot for each, and then I give it the function, the thing to do on each loop. And notice I'm not using parentheses because this is what's referred to as a callback, where I'm saying, hey, I'm not using this function. I'm not using the thing to do on each loop. I'm giving it to this for each function that expects it. Because again, if we hover over for each to take a look at its signature, see it says it's a method, it's a function. Okay, and what it expects is a callback function. That's what you call a function you pass as an argument. And see, that function takes in a value that's a number and an index that's a number. And theoretically, we could have defined a third argument that's the array. So again, I can read that. Let me just over that again. So see, it takes in that argument, which is the callback function. Okay, which returns nothing. Okay, and then it's going to return nothing. So what this function does is perform the function, whatever that function is, it's going to run on each for each thing in the array. So now I should see that the thing to do on each loop should happen once for each thing in the array, which is literally just going to console log it. So now we should see it 3 times. See 1, 2, 3, 6, 1, 2, 3, 6. Okay, so let's just kind of separate these out so you can see each one clearly. Console.log normal for loop. Okay, so again, all 3 of these are ways to loop, and another word for looping is iterate. Okay, you're doing repetitive steps. Okay, and this is the for of loop, because we have to do that whole of thing. So it's like for thing of things. So this is always going to be an existing an array, and this is always a new variable you're declaring to hold the thing in the array. And then this is the for each callback method, which is a function built into arrays that allows you to give it a function that does for each callback function. They all do the same thing. So again, if I loop, there we go. So you can see here, normal for loop, 1 through 6, for of loop. And then for each, they're doing the same thing. They're just looping over, but there are different ways to loop. Which way is the best way? There are some slight differences in performance. We don't need to worry about that now. But whichever way you find most comfortable to loop over an array is the way you should use for now. Get used to the idea of, hey, I want to repeat something. So maybe like, let's create like a script that takes advantage of this. Okay, so we'll say, you know, my add1.ts. Okay, what I want to do is write a script that is going to take an array of numbers. We're going to use Deno, okay, and loop over that array of arguments. Okay, problem is, again, the array of arguments are going to be a string, because again, arguments always come in as a string, so keep that in mind. So what I am going to do is say, hey, you know what I'd like to do? So I want to be able to pass in some numbers. So we'll say, we'll create a function, you know, to do on each loop. And again, that's going to take in the item, which is going to be a string because we're using args. We're going to be using that args array. And then we're going to receive the index, which is going to be a number, because it's generally always how you do these callback functions for arrays. How do you know? Again, you read the signature. How do I know that's how the function should look like? Well, if I do this, Deno dot args dot for each. Okay, I don't think it'll actually give me any information right now because it's not going to recognize the Deno object. But again, the Deno.args object, as we saw in the previous video, is just an array of strings. So essentially, this would be that same for each function. There. Okay. So what I'm going to do is for each item, we're going to say, you know, num, const num, which is going to be a number, equals parse int item. So I'm taking that item and turning it into a number. And then I'm going to console.log that num plus 5. Or actually, yeah, plus 1, because we call this plus 1. And then there we go. That's our script. So let's say I wanted to write the script and say, hey, I want to give this script a bunch of numbers. So Deno run add1.ts. Then I give it a bunch of numbers. One, not even commas. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because each item separated by a space is an argument. So if I run this script, except I spelled Deno wrong, not Denu, Deno. What did it look like? The argument for a callback function was not provided. Oh, I forgot to give it the function to do on each loop. So I give it the function, so it's going to loop over each thing in the array and use that function on it. And see, that's what it does. It took the first thing, the first argument, added 1 to it, then because it was looping over that array. Okay, so imagine I wanted to just sit there and say, hey, I have all these like numbers that I wanted to do some sort of uniform mathematical operation. I could use, again, I could write a script that can do that operation for me. So let's say maybe I have a bunch of numbers at the end of the day that I need a certain process to, I can write the script. It'll loop over the arguments and give me back the number. So that way I don't have to do the calculations manually. And so point is, you can make scripts that make your life easier. That's what I'm trying to show you, that you, even though we're not at the point where we're making full-on applications, you can already use what you know to create practically useful things. Okay, and but yeah, so we'll leave it at that as far as like looping. Okay, so there's different ways to loop over an array. Looping can take a bit. I do have another video called Looping Masterclass. I have another one called Iterating Masterclass. If you want to just see some extra reps, no pun intended, on looping and whatnot. And then I also have like Callback Masterclass. We'll be doing more callbacks in the next video. So we'll be continuing with that whole concept of giving a function to another function. But I'll see you guys there. See you later. Have a good one. Ciao.